All right, we'll go ahead and get started then. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. We're really happy that you're here joining us. You must be interested in how to build and maintain a strong sustainability resume, and we have a lot to share. So first, just go ahead and make yourself comfortable, put away any distractions. You'd be surprised at the power of simply turning your phone face down. That helps me a lot. Make sure that your audio is muted throughout the presentation. If you'd like, you can turn your video on, but that is completely up to you. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. I will be our technology guru keeping an eye on the chat box, and so we would love to get those answered as we go. Don't feel like, if you send a question, you'll be interrupting the flow of the presentation. We want you to send your questions as we go, but we will also reserve time at the end to answer all your questions. And just on the off chance that we do run out of time, don't worry. We will hang around as long as it takes to get all of your questions answered at the end. So go ahead and start sending those questions at any time. We will also be sending a follow-up email with all of the resources that we mentioned, as well as the presentation slides and the recording of this presentation. So if you are watching this as a recording, feel free to still reach out to us directly with any questions, or simply just to get those resources and slides in the recording as well. All right, so we will start with some introductions. Your hosts for this webinar are Jessica Davis and myself, Cristina Padilla. I will let you go first, Jess.
Sure. So my name's Jessica, the Director of the Office of Sustainability here at IUPUI. I've been in the sustainability field for about 10 years now, pretty much straight out of undergrad and all in higher ed. And I've actually been on a handful of hiring committees, both for sustainability positions as well as not sustainability positions. So I'm hopeful that I can bring a little bit of kind of insider information as far as what does a hiring committee look like, whether that's for sustainability or not, and how you can use that to your advantage. So even though we kind of curated this specifically for sustainability, a lot of the pointers that we're going to have today will work regardless of the field, but we are going to talk specifically about some of the sustainability aspects of the job search.
And like I said, my name is Cristina. I am the Sustainability Engagement Coordinator at IUPUI Sustainability. I'm a proud IUPUI alum. I graduated in 2017 with a degree in Sustainable Management and Policy and a certificate in Sustainable Technologies. I briefly worked at the City of Indianapolis Office of Sustainability and have happily landed here back at IUPUI where it all began. And throughout both of my experiences, I have been part of hiring committees, mostly for interns, but I have been a part of some of those discussions and am happy to share what I've learned along the way. All right, so before we dive into the meat of the presentation, let's just kind of review very quickly what it is that you are up against. You are up against a lot of candidates, probably more than you realize. During my time at the city, I came to find out that for any given job posting, depending on the job, there was, you could expect around 100 to 300 candidates, give or take. At IUPUI, that has been a little bit different with our internship postings. We typically tend to see between, 1 to 3 dozen candidates, maybe, depending on the position. And you're also up against very similar formatting. At the end of the day, a resume and a cover letter is just a piece of paper. And there are only, there's only so much you can do to inject your personality into it. And lastly, if you are up against qualified candidates, you may have very similar experiences. So we will talk about how to set yourself apart. And so often we go through life kind of just seeing everything through our own perspective, our own lens that we have developed based on our life experiences. And sometimes that's a good thing, and at times that can really hold you back. So it would serve you well to put yourself in the shoes of the person that is going to be doing the hiring and that is going to look at your resume and think about what they want to see. What do they want to get out of reviewing your application? Can you fulfill the duties of the job successfully? Will you fit into the workplace culture that they have cultivated there? And then once you think about that, you can ask yourself some really important questions like, how can I provide the person who is doing the hiring everything that they need in order to feel confident that I can fulfill the duties of the job? And we will go more into detail throughout the presentation about how you can do that. But specifically in your cover letter, that is a great opportunity for you to link back specifically what is in the job description and how your experiences have given you the skills that you need to fulfill that. Next, how will you stand out from other candidates? There are good ways to stand out, and then there are also bad ways to stand out. So when we say this, we don't mean that, to inject so much of your personality that maybe you're like wanting to use a quirky font or something like that. Rather, we want to think of ways that you can stand out for your accomplishments and your skills. So for example, you'd be surprised how much you can stand out just by really customizing your resume. And how can you meaningfully use the time of the person that is reviewing your resume? Jessica and I discussed about how so often we see candidates that just want to add every single experience that they've ever had into their resume. And from their perspective, this is a positive, but potentially if you are the person who is reviewing these resumes and you have 100 of these to look at, then this is not an effective use of their time to be reading about the job that you had, maybe when you were in high school or depends on how much experience you have. And we will go more into that. So, and lastly, there are a lot of things about a resume or a cover letter that might be turning people off and you might not even realize. So potentially it'd be a good idea to have other people review your resume, and we would be happy to do that if you are viewing this. But let's go ahead and dive deeper into what this all means and how you can do better.
Yeah, so it's going to be really important to always be taking on the position of the person who is hiring. I know it can be easy when you might be desperate for a job or desperate for a change to be thinking about my perspective, what I want, what I need. But the way that you're going to have the strongest application is if you step back and you say, what is the person who wants to hire? What do they want? And how can I do that? That'll have you create a way stronger resume and a way stronger cover letter. So the first part we're going to start with is the resume itself. Then we're going to go on to cover letters, and then we're going to go on to a section called tracking, where it's a way to keep track of all of the experiences and the awards and basically all the great stuff that you've done in a way that's organized that will hopefully set you up to have a better resume and cover letter. But first we're going to start with the resume. So the big question, what is the point of a resume, right? It's not just to hey, here you go. I hope you'll hire me. There's a very specific reason why we put together a resume. And the number one thing is to show evidence of your ability, meaning you have to be able to clearly communicate that you are capable of doing the job. Also to display your personal brand or who you are a little bit. So there may be some calls to make there as far as how creative you might be able to be. Sometimes that's specific by field, but you can I can tell a lot about maybe the way somebody might be by how they organize their resume, or by what font they chose, or how small the margins are, or was it consistent? You can demonstrate to someone that, hey, maybe I'm really organized, or I know that this is going to be easy for you to read. The big one is customization. We get this a little bit when we have our internships on campus, where it's obvious that a student has submitted the same resume and cover letter to about 100 different jobs. And it wasn't specific to the role that we had, and we could tell that immediately. So when people are on hiring committees, they're going to be able to tell that as well, that you just submitted this information with maybe not no regard, but little regard for the specific goals of that position. And unfortunately, with customization comes time and effort. So that's what we're going to talk about tracking at the end, because if you put in a lot of the upfront work that's necessary to have a really good tracking system, then the process of customizing your cover letter and resume every time you apply for something becomes that much less painful. But every time you submit a resume and cover letter, it should be tailored to the position that you are applying for. We shouldn't be doing these big blasts where we just send the same resume and cover letter to every position. We're going to be able to tell that on the back end, because we will have people who did take the time to customize it. And when you put those two next to each other, it's going to be obvious the difference. Also, your resume is an opportunity to demonstrate your skills in critical thinking. Like, were you able to creatively communicate how an experience that may not be directly or obviously related to a role helped you or provided you with skills to get where you are now? Attention to detail and grammar and writing. Did you have misspellings? Were your margins all the same? Was your font all the same? Organization, was I able to read this and not like lose my mind because there were indentations everywhere and my eyes were all over the page? Like, did you train me to how to read your resume? These can all give us hints about how good of a writer you may be, or how organized you might be in putting together meeting minutes or running a meeting. If you can show a logical flow in your resume or in your cover letter, it also shows that you will hopefully be able to apply that same sort of logic when it comes to the workplace as well. So all of these things are just small hints that we pick up on about you, whether you actually mean them to be hints or not. We're actually reading into that from the hiring perspective. So the first thing we're going to start with is formatting. And some of this earlier stuff might be stuff that you've heard from past folks who may have looked at your resume and cover letter. But as we go through, we'll get a little bit more detailed. The first thing, remember what you're up against. One of the big things that you're up against is that there are going to be a lot of candidates. So how do you stand out? And one of the quickest ways that you can stand out is by having a resume that without me even reading the content just looks nice. As in, I can just glance at it and say, this is not going to be a pain for me to read because it looks organized and I haven't read a single word of it yet. Right? I can just tell by the way it's laid out. And the way that you can do that is by training the eye of your reader. So the way that you train the eye of your reader is that if in these, like the first quarter of the page, you set up the expectation for your reader of what does it mean whenever you bold something, or what does it mean whenever you italicize something? Or if there's a date, it's always going to be over to the right or over to the left. So within the first, like less than half of the first page, I'm looking for the writer to train me how to read their resume. So if I need to find something, I can say, oh, I noticed stuff there that if anything was important, it was bolded. So I need to make sure I'm looking out for this over the course of the resume, because remember, I might have 100 of these to read. So I'm really looking for any way to stop reading your resume, because I've got so many to look at. So don't give me a way to escape. And the first thing you can do is suck me in by making it look good. So same font throughout, consistent formatting, same header. So have your header for your resume and your cover letter match, right? Usually they come back to back and I'll know for sure, oh yeah, this is that same person's because it has the same flavor to it. Another thing I like to do, and this may be different for where you are in your career at this point. If you're just out of undergrad, you may only have a one-pager resume where it's just a front page. But if you have been around a little bit longer, you want to expand upon some of the experiences that you have had as an undergrad, as long as they're valuable, you might end up using the back page of something. So in the footer of my resume, I always will put page X of Y. So page 1 of 2 or 1 of 4 or whatever it is. And that's a visual signal to the person who is reading, like, hey, don't miss page 2 of this. It can be really easy when you're looking at 100 resumes to just start flipping through them, and you may not even notice that somebody has a back page, and that may have been where all the great stuff is. We'll talk about why you shouldn't put the great stuff on the back page, but you may lose somebody's ability to figure out that, hey, you had a really great skill and it just didn't show up on page 1. So I do that as a visual signal to somebody to let them know, turn the page over, right? Or keep reading, don't end here. Another thing is full pages only. So I don't want to pick up a resume where it's got one whole page and I turn it over and the next is like a one tiny paragraph at the top of the next. Don't do that to me, right? Use a full page. If you're going to use a page, use a full page at the front. If you're going to use a second page, you need to make sure that second page is full. We're not into partial pages here, mainly because if you did only use a little sliver at the top, really, you probably could have formatted your resume a bit better to have it all fit on the first, or you could have communicated more effectively to have it fit all on the first, versus if you do have 1 3/4 pages, I'm going to ask what, so they didn't have enough more great stuff about themselves to fill out 5 more lines of content. So that's where that kind of like the full page rule kind of comes. And then as far as design, there are some really creative resumes out there. There have been some people who even design web pages that look like, you know, like a video game. And as you scroll down, like you learn more about them. Make sure that you know your field and that you are using a design or an aesthetic that is appropriate for your field. So if you're going into graphic design, then I would probably say, yeah, your resume better look like a knockout, because graphic design is your field. And if you submit a Times New Roman font size 12 resume to a graphic design firm, they may think, what the heck? This was this person's opportunity to kind of flex their muscles for their graphic design skills, and they didn't do that. Versus if you're in a field that's a bit more traditional, sometimes those really flashy resumes might work to your disadvantage. Because oftentimes those really flashy designs, you may actually lose space to explain what you're trying to do in an effort to improve the design. So what I would say is know your field. If you're not sure, ask around to people who are in your field and say, hey, what's the best resume and cover letter format? I want to make sure I'm adhering to the standards of my field, and that also lets the people know that you know the standards of their field. So sustainability tends to be a bit more traditional. You'll see more of the traditional resume cover letter design, but that isn't to say that you can't still inject a little bit of creativity into that. So just recognize that design choices can be all the way, there's a whole spectrum there, but just know your field and choose whichever one is appropriate. All right, the next one is grammar. This is a big one, especially for me. I'm a grammar stickler. And also remember, we're looking for a way to stop reading your resume because we've got 100 of these to look at. So I want to be able to cull quickly, who's a no, who's a no, who's a no. And an easy way to do that, unfortunately, is to have spelling and grammatical errors. I have been on hiring committees where somebody will address the cover letter to a different company. Oh man, that is a really bad place to start. It makes it really, really hard for me to read the rest of your letter, where instead of starting it out as, you know, I'm applying for a job at IUPUI, it said I'm applying for a job at Purdue, but you applied to IUPUI, right? So be really aware of that. One thing that also this is a little bit of stickler stuff, but when you're talking about experiences that you have had in the past, use past tense. Versus if you are talking about a position that you currently hold and you have not left or haven't been fired or anything, you have that job right now and you're just looking to make a move. When you're talking about that job, you use present tense because you presently hold it. That's an easy way for a hirer to know right away what positions you still hold and don't hold. Another thing is starting sentences or phrases or bullet points or however you choose to list your experience, and we can talk about different ways to do that. Start those phrases with a consistent part of speech. So for example, when we go over mine, you'll notice that all of the way that I describe my employment history, or the way that I describe the job, I always start with a verb, right? Managed, led, directed, wrote. So I pick an action verb to start with that, with each one of those descriptors. It can be kind of messy and a little bit fumbly if you go back and forth between starting your sentences different ways. Again, this is about training the eye of your reader, right? If I know, oh, hey, this person is starting every single one of their descriptors with a verb, cool, right? I know what they're gonna say and I know where it's headed. Versus if it's different, every time you write something, I have to like take a bit more time to like stop and try to digest it. This one is a big one. I think especially for folks who are recently out of school, this is a really big one. Use strong, confident, and action-oriented words. Confident is really important. So I've read cover letters where somebody will say, well, I may be able to do that. No, 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 no. You will be able to do that. There's a difference between I may be and I can or I will. If I read maybe, that I immediately interpreted that as hesitation, right? I'm not sure. And I know that it can be, we don't want to get in the position where we're overstating what we do because we don't want people to think that we're better than we are. But if you're confident that you can do something, then tell somebody, I can do this and I will do it. And as you talk to them, you'll be able to demonstrate that, yes, that is true. But if I read maybes, or sometimes I'm fairly certain, no, I am certain. If you try to qualify your skill sets, that's where I'm like, oh man, this person isn't even confident in themselves. How can I be confident in their ability to do it? So confidence is really important, written confidence. And also bust out your thesaurus. You don't have to bust out the actual book anymore. There's like a right-click thesaurus option in Word. But I see resumes where folks will use the same words over and over again to describe what they have done. That gets really boring. And also it doesn't demonstrate to us the breadth of experience that you have, right? So there's a lot of different ways to say managed, led, spearheaded, right? So pick these words that they all kind of mean a little bit of the same thing, but it adds flavor to your resume. It makes it not so boring to read. And also when I look down a column, I don't want every bullet point saying responsible for. That's the biggest one that I see is responsible for. No. But what does responsible for mean? Does it mean that you actually managed it? Does it mean that you were an assistant? Did you assist? Did you lead? Like, explain these things. Those phrases, people like to use them over and over again, but they're not particularly helpful.
Can I add something to this, Jessica?
Go.
Yeah, loads of words that you can use. Coordinated, developed, managed, assisted, supported. And just to even dive into like the confidence piece, I think that this is worth diving into just outside of grammar, because we know a lot of people who are very, very modest and humble. And there's nothing wrong with that under any other circumstance. You know, that is a great attribute, but this is absolutely not the time to be modest or humble about what you do. This is the time for you to sell yourself. And if that doesn't come naturally to you, then you might actually have to put some work into, you know, developing a strong list of different positive qualities about yourself that you can talk about, so that in the moment when they ask you about what your strengths are, you're not, you know, racking your brain about, well, what is it that I'm not sure. So especially with our students, you know, this confidence piece is so important with your resume and your cover letter and interview.
Yeah, the last thing we want you to do is to undersell yourself. You all have skills. Don't sell yourself short because you think that maybe you may not be as good as somebody else. We're not measuring you. Like we want to know what you can do, right? Because here's the thing, if you're not confident in your language, you better believe that there are going to be other people in that stack who are, and they're going to stand out because their confidence told us something. So you might as well just do it. Just get over the fear, get over your humility. It's always good to be humble, right? We get that, but don't undersell your stuff. Don't undersell yourself. All right, now as far as the content itself, one of the biggest things, the thing that I always go to read the first in any resume, no matter how that resume is formatted, I'm always going to go read their experiences first. Because let's go back to that question. What does a hirer want to know? They want to know, can you do the job? And the way that I will know if you can do the job is by looking at your experience, because that is evidence that you have done it in the past. So the experiences can be a lot of different things, right? So usually it might show up as work experience or relevant work experience, right? To get away from folks who want to post every job they've ever had, I recommend rename that relevant work experience. So you're only going to share the experience that's relevant to the role that you're trying to apply for. But work experience can be paid or unpaid. Just because you had an unpaid internship doesn't mean that that wasn't work or that wasn't employment. It's just that you didn't take home a paycheck. So don't undersell your unpaid experiences by saying, well, it was just an internship, or oh, it was just this. No. If you dedicated a significant amount of time to it, that is experience. And if somebody has questions about whether it was paid or unpaid, well, you can talk to them about that later in the interview. But don't just decide, well, that's not important enough to count because I didn't get paid for it. That's not true. So experience can be paid and unpaid. Education can be another form of experience, especially if you took certain courses that you know are going to make you a stronger candidate compared to your competitors. So an example of this, if you're going into like something like urban planning, maybe your degree in geography, maybe a lot of folks in the field have that. However, if you also graduated and took a handful of courses in geographical information systems, which is a mapping course, which you can get a certification in, that's worth mentioning. So there may be a handful of courses that you took beyond what other folks in your degree program may have taken, and that's going to show that you went above and beyond to get experience that other people may not have. Volunteer experience is also legitimate experience that you should be talking about. And I'll say there's a line here in like when to talk about or include experience. If you went to one volunteer event and was there for an hour, I would probably say that doesn't belong on your resume. Mainly because you have to assume that if you put something on your resume or your cover letter, it is fair game that somebody will ask you about it. And if you put something on there that you were a volunteer with, say, Keeping an App is Beautiful, and somebody says, well, tell me about your time with KIB. What all did you do with them? Who all? You never know. People, they may know everyone at KIB, right? Like, you know, I talked to them and they didn't recognize your name. So there's a line there where you got to decide when the volunteer opportunity or experience counts and is worthy enough to end up in your resume. So I would qualify that to say dedicated volunteer experience, that you're there quite a bit, right? People know your face, they know your name, and you're learning something from that. And if somebody were to ask you about your experiences, you could tell them at length about what you did. If that's the kind of volunteerism you have done, for sure, put that on your resume. Accreditations and certifications could be another form of experience, right? So it's beyond the classroom. They're usually a third party. And usually if someone has an accreditation or a certification, it's an indication that they took another step, right? They put in the extra work to go get this. So make sure you put those on your resume and be prepared to talk about them. Memberships with organizations, especially if you're active in those memberships, that can point to how you are spending your free time. So if even in your free time you're working on sustainability, well, that's pretty impressive. Soft and hard skills, so we'll talk about the difference between those. Those can help point to your experiences. And then also publications, that's more for like the academic world, but even if you have a blog or a social media profile where you've got a lot of followers and you're talking about sustainability, put a link to that stuff on there. That lets people know how serious you are about the work that you're in. So experiences doesn't always mean what you were paid for. That's the take-home message of this one. Another thing that's important with experiences is that you have to be able to communicate how your experiences are related to the job that you want, right? So you may have experiences in other areas, but if it's not necessarily related to the job that you want, then leave it off. That's not to say that it wasn't valuable or that you didn't learn something from it. But again, let's get back to what the hirer thinks. They might think, well, why did this person put in here that, you know, they worked at a laundromat in high school if the job isn't anything related to that? At that point, it's how are you using my time as a reviewer of your resume? Highlight your experiences that are related to the role. So again, explicitly call those out, and also use numbers to demonstrate your impact. So if you managed a group of volunteers, don't just write responsible for volunteer management, say managed a group of 150 volunteers over the course of 40 weeks, right? Those numbers give concrete evidence of your ability to do that particular skill. And also it lets me know I can visualize that you have done it, right? So responsible for volunteers, I could have painted a really small picture in my head. But if you were to give numbers like that, like, oh, wow, that's a lot bigger than I thought it was. All right, content. What is the order that it should go in? I think people will have different sort of philosophies about this, but my philosophy is that you always want to lead with whatever is the strongest that will get the attention of the hirer the most. And again, we're going back to those fundamental questions. Can they do the job? Whatever information about you communicates that first or communicates that best should be first. So for most folks, no matter what, we're going to put our name and our contact information at the top. But for most folks, their relevant work experience will be next, or relevant volunteer experience will be next, because that's where you'll be able to communicate concretely what you have done and how you have done it. After that, maybe your skills, being able to, first of all, know your skills and list them confidently. There may be certain programming or certain assessment tools that are common throughout the field. If you put those skills in there, it signals to the person who's reviewing your resume that, hey, this person knows this, and they've used it before. Certifications, accreditations, again, that's a beyond, right? You didn't have to do that, but you did, and it shows dedication. And oftentimes I tend to put education first, or I'm sorry, last. When I'm reading resumes, that's usually the last thing I go to look at. Mainly because you don't necessarily have to have a degree in a particular field in order to be able to do it well. So at bare minimum, there's usually an education minimum requirement, and usually HR has scanned that, and we wouldn't even have your resume in our hand unless you met that minimum requirement. So I know at minimum, everyone has the education that's necessary. So to me, that's usually the least interesting thing about you, because to me, it doesn't matter what your degree is, it matters, can you do the job? So that's how I tend to read things in that order. Even if somebody leads with education, I find that I gloss over that and I go straight to their experiences section. And then I might come back to that later because I'm looking for them to tell me, can they do the job? All right, so now real quick, I'm gonna take you a little bit behind the scenes and I'm gonna show you my resume. And this is a little bit old because remember, every resume is customized to the position and I haven't looked for jobs in a while. So it definitely needs some updating, but I went through and tried to like do some real quick updating just to like bring it a little bit up to speed. So I'm going to show you what my resume looks like in current form. Okay, can we see that? Cool, all right. So this is my resume. As I mentioned, in the sustainability field, it's a little bit more traditional. So you'll notice that I'm not being crazy with my design here. But my header is the same across both my resume and my cover letter, actually the same. And I put my degree, so graduate degrees you can usually list after your name, but also this is an accredited certification. So that's right after my name as well. So that's an immediate indicator to somebody that, hey, I've got something going on besides the degree. And then I just put my phone number and my email address. I don't necessarily think you need to put your physical address anymore. That's less important, mainly because people move all the time for jobs. And at some point, it just takes up a little bit of space. So I tend to forego that. And if somebody needs to get a hold of me, they're not going to send me a letter anyway. They're going to call me, text me, or email me. So. And then you'll notice the first thing that I lead with is relevant work experience. So as I go through this, you're not going to see on here that I worked at a veterinary clinic all through high school or that I was a zookeeper at the Indianapolis Zoo. Why? Because those are not relevant to sustainability jobs. And in this case, I'm applying to a sustainability job. Now, if I were applying for an animal care job, you better believe those jobs would be on there, right? Because that's relevant experience to that job. So you'll notice I start training the eye of the reader right away. So sections of the resume are bold and big font. I have the employer, the location of the employer, and then my role and the date right under that. So you'll notice that font or that sort of formatting will be consistent throughout the resume. And then this section right here is the description of the job, right? And you'll notice here that these start with serve, right? Act, manage, assess. Those are all verbs. They all start with the same thing. And I've separated mine with semicolons, so they read kind of like a paragraph. Depending on how long your resume is, you might want to do bullet points. It just kind of depends on how you fill the space and what your preference is for the look. For me, the reason I did it this way is because, remember, a job description or my job description does not tell anybody how well I did my job. It just says what my job is. And I'm interested in telling somebody how well I do my job. So this is what my job description is, this section right here. However, this part tells people how well I have done my job, right? So this is where I spend more time and I like fleshed out, gave bullet points, and I gave, hey, here are concrete examples of how I have done this job well. So they first need to know what job I held, but then they need to know, yes, you can do it well. So like I said, this is a little bit older, so it needs some updating. But you'll notice here that, again, my verbiage is the same across all of these bullet points, right? Hosted, named, earned, ranked. And I even put qualifiers here. So ranked Sierra Club Cool School number 57 in 2017. Well, somebody might say, well, what the heck is that? Yeah, is that a big deal? Well, yeah, it's a big deal because it was the highest university rating to date. So you can sometimes get in a little bit of that pickle where just because you list an award doesn't necessarily mean that anybody knows what that means. So provide a little bit of extra information to them so they understand why you're listing that, hey, I'm listing this because it's important and you should know how it's important. I'm also associate faculty, so you can see some of my, same formatting, right? And job title, how long I've been doing it, what I do. Because this was a sustainability resume, not a teaching resume, I didn't flesh out on my teaching accomplishments then. I could have, right, but I didn't. Here's another one, another job, assistant director, the job itself, and then some of the big highlights from that particular role. And this isn't to say that, oh, I only had 2 important things that happened in this role, but as you go back in time, maybe my accomplishments become a little bit less important, right? It's about what have you done recently, unfortunately. So that's why my highlights are biggest in this section, because this is the position I currently hold. And I want to demonstrate that, yes, in my immediate position, I've been killing it, right? I want people to know that. Then we'll go back here to the last job that I list, working for Marion, and a couple of highlights there. I also have here at the bottom, it's a little bit cut off just because of Google Drive. I actually give them my LinkedIn and my Twitter handle. If people want to go look me up, I want to make sure they're looking up the version of me that I want them to see, right? Especially with my name, Jessica Davis. It's a pretty generic name. I don't want them to find a Jessica Davis who maybe has done something not so great. I want them to find me. So the way that I encourage that is by saying, hey, here's my handle, go look for me, right? This is the version of me that's really me, not somebody else you might be mistaken for me. It also kind of shows transparency, right? Hey, I'm not hiding any of this from you, go look for it. Skills. So I have this section as well. So hard skills and soft skills. Hard skills are more like technical knowledge that you have, right? You know, can you do something, right? If I were to give you a log onto this particular platform, would you be able to run with it? Soft skills are things that are more kind of personality based, or just like what you've learned over time. Like how well can you work with others? Can you collaborate well? Do you have attention to detail? Things like that. So I tend to call out both of those because we're not machines, right? We don't just have technical skills. It also really matters who we are as people. Also, by listing these soft skills, it also lets them know what I think is important about me. Things that might set me apart from somebody else. Like, for example, I think that it is good for me to say that I think I have excellent verbal communication skills. Hopefully you're seeing this today, right? I think that's important to state. And then they'll be able to hear that from me in person when I meet them. So this is also your way of cluing them into what pieces about you think are the most impressive, because they will ask you about that later. Then the next section of my resume is more metrics of my accomplishments, right? What's proof that I can do what I say I can do? So for example, I've got funded grants here in the sustainability world. For some positions, writing and winning grants is going to be an important part of the role, and others not so much. But I think having a section on this specifically demonstrates I know how to write, and I know how to write convincingly. And if you know how to write convincingly, then you maybe also know how to speak convincingly, which is going to be really important anytime you're getting people to change in the sustainability field. So this is just another way to tell people, hey, here's a skill that might tell you a little bit more about me and who I am. My professional affiliations, so these are some of the organizations that I'm a part of. Some of these will be recognized, right? So USGBC, if you're in the sustainability field, everybody knows that. So that is an indicator, that's my way of hinting to the reader, listen, I know about USGBC and I'm involved with them. So a lot of these are recognized names. Or maybe it's something I put on there because I want somebody to ask me about it later because I think it's a great experience to talk about, but I didn't have time to write about it or space to write about it in my resume. And then I lump my education and my certifications together. You don't necessarily have to do this. I just did it as a space saver. So I have there, again, the similar type of formatting. So the name of the granting institution, whether it's a certification or a university, and then the degree, the location, and where I got it. Some people put their GPAs on there. Maybe when you're fresh out of school, you might want to, but really over time, it becomes kind of less of a thing that people might care about or want to know about. So up to you. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our presentation. Let me stop sharing this screen real quick. So hopefully that was helpful. And we're going to talk about cover letter. So cover letter, what's the point of this? I have seen some really, really bad cover letters. And usually they're bad because all that somebody did was basically rewrite their resume. I didn't need you to do that twice, right? If I wanted to read your resume, I'd just write it, or I just read it. The point of a cover letter is to provide supplemental information that you didn't have the space or the time to cover in your resume that would provide additional evidence of you being a strong candidate. It's another opportunity to expand upon your abilities, maybe provide a specific example of when you demonstrated something and how you did it, draw connections to a particular experience you had and your skills, but what it is not, is it's not your diary. Meaning, again, let's go back to this big question. What do we want to know? We want to know, can you do the job? And while it's great to talk about how passionate you are about something, and I think that should certainly come through in your resume and cover letter, I also don't want to read a cover letter where you talked about how as a 5-year-old kid, you went camping with your family in the Rocky Mountains, and it was then that you decided that you loved the environment and wanted to protect it, and then you tell me the rest of your life story. That doesn't tell me if you can do the job. It's great that you go camping and you love the Rocky Mountains and all of this, but that doesn't tell me, can you do the job? When you come into the interview, I can ask you, so why did you care about this? And that's where those stories can come out. But again, this is about, can you do the job? So tell me that you can, and make it not so much a diary entry. So now I'm going to show you a little bit of, I'm going to show you my cover letter. And I will say this one is not a perfect example because there are things that I would change now, but I think it's still pretty good. And this is the cover letter that I wrote for the job that I currently have. So it's definitely old because I haven't done a new one since. So you'll even notice, so this heading doesn't match because my one that I showed you was a newer one. So this is my old address. I wouldn't have put that on in the past. So I tend to use, I have a very specific method to my madness for a cover letter because, again, it's that question, can you do the job? So I thought, if I'm on the hiring committee, all I want to know is, can they do the job? And what's the quickest way for me to communicate that? And it's what I came up with here. And I still actually recommend this even to like my interns and stuff, because I think it's a really effective and efficient way to communicate to somebody. So what I did is I just had a really short paragraph at the top that says, hey, this is the job that I want. Based on my experiences, I think I'd be a good fit. And also here's evidence of how I'd be a good fit. So what I did is I created a table in Word. And in one column, I literally copied the job requirements. What does this person have to do? And then the other column, I put, what are my qualifications? How do I demonstrate that I can do this? And you'll notice these are pretty long, but I would have never had the time to put all of this or the space to put all of this in my resume, right? There's just not enough space. So this provided me more real estate for me to talk about the things that I can do very specifically through the lens of this job, right? Very specifically through that lens. All right, so provide sustainability leadership. Hey, here are ways that I have provided leadership in my other roles. Serve as a campus educational resource. Hey, here are ways that I have done that in my other roles. Specifically, let me tell you about certain times I've done it. Here, serve as a campus spokesperson. Hey, here are ways that I have already demonstrated that I can do this. I've gone to conferences, I've given presentations, I've given guest lectures. And my cover letter is a one-pager because those were the big job requirements. Like there were those big 3 bullet points. And sometimes job requirements will have like 50 things. Distill them down to like what the main points are. You'll find that there will be common threads. You say, okay, really, these 5 things really meant this one thing, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, if I were to do this, it might be 2 pages long, but really, I think a cover letter should probably be 1. Anything longer than that, and I'm gonna wonder why you wasted my time, girl. Like, don't talk so much. I'm thrilled to further discuss it, and here's how you can contact me. Thank you for your time. Right? Short, sweet, not a diary entry, just pure data on how I can do the job, and then of course my signature. So I actually really like this model for me personally, because it also forces you to see how you do and do not match up for a job. And it forces you to think about, like, pull it out from the depths of your experience. Okay, I did this one thing, and actually that does speak to this particular role. I need to make sure that I mention that. So it forces you to think that way. Okay, back to the presentation. Just jumping back and forth here. Okie dokie. All right, so the last section we're going to talk about is tracking your work. Tracking, so what is tracking? So tracking is a way for you to keep track of all of your experiences, your skills, your education, your volunteerism, classes that you've taken, certifications that you've earned, things that you've learned, skills that you've picked up in one central location. So why do we track? Ease of customizing your resume and cover letter. For me, like if I were to build a new resume and cover letter, I'm going back to my tracking document and I'm going to literally copy and paste from my tracking document to build the resume and the cover letter that I want. Instead of sitting there and have to, oh, what did I do? What was that like? What did I learn from that? Go somewhere else, spill your guts there, put the time in there, and then your future self will thank you because it will make resume and cover letter building way quicker in the future. It's a central repository for everything. So it's also a good way to keep track of yourself because the last bullet point, it is super easy to forget what you've done, especially like as your career progresses, you're like, oh man, like I guess I really did do that really impressive thing back in like 2017. I completely forgot about it. So it's a really good way to combat forgetting. And also it's just a good way to celebrate yourself. You know, I usually update mine once, maybe twice a year, force myself go back and like, yeah, I did have a good year, right? This is good for me to go through this exercise. So how do you track? I'm going to show you what I do, and you're free to do whatever you want to do, but the version that I use is I just find a spreadsheet's the easiest thing. It's easy to update. It's easy to live in the cloud somewhere. I typically create tabs with meaningful categories for the experiences that I have, and I'll show you what it looks like. But also it's beyond experiences. You can also collect evidence there. So for example, links to news articles. Maybe you did a YouTube video and you want to save that. Pamphlets that you've created. If you did something on a specific date and that date matters, save that date there. Maybe track personal accomplishments versus professional accomplishments, right? Personal accomplishments mean a lot too. So don't think of it as just like necessarily work-related stuff or just text. You can also have it live as this big database for who you are. So I'm going to show you what my tracking document looks like. And mine's also a little bit out of date. I haven't hit my 1-year mark for updating it. Here we go. Can we see this? Christina, can we see? Okay, good. So this is my tracking document. You'll notice the names of the tabs at the bottom. So education, grants, presentations, appointments, publications, awards, teaching, invited talks. So I have a whole bunch of different things here because these are things that will have currency or will have value for me, I think, going forward. So you can create tabs for you specifically based on what you think is valuable for your specific field. But these are the ones that I think have been good for me to kind of fill in. And sometimes I'll come up with a new one and start a new one just because like, yeah, I should probably start tracking this separately. So for example, education, right? Here's the organization, the location, the degree certification, and the date that I earned it, right? So now whenever I go to build my resume, I don't have to remember back to when that is. I can just come here and copy and paste it. Grants are another one. So for example, here's the grant, whether it was funded or not, the amount that we won, what sort of role I held, right? Because sometimes I want to count things differently. If I was a partner in something, I might count it differently than if I was a co-author or a lead author. And then also who else was involved in it, right? Because I want to be able to, if somebody says, well, did you do all this yourself? No, I didn't, right? We did it as a team and I want to be able to talk about that. And then at the bottom, you'll say, okay, well, here's total IUPUI funding, add those up, other organizations. Some of these are actually personal grants that I've won. And I actually keep track of the ones that we haven't won too, because I think that's important to keep track of the ones you haven't won, because just because you didn't win it doesn't mean it was a good idea or it wasn't a strong application, you just didn't win it. Presentations, so these are things like conference presentations. So I'll put, you know, who all I presented with, the name of it, where it was, the date. And then I'll also, if there is a pamphlet for that specific conference, I will put a link to it so that I can, hey, here's the pamphlets where somebody needs evidence that I actually presented at this conference. I can print this out and show it to them. I'm not just making it up. So I'll try to find the link for that if I can. Appointments for me, that's just the role that I've held and how long I held it. So again, that's a good way for me to keep track of that. awards, what the organization was, the award name, when I received it. I probably should actually create another section, which is an award description, because not everybody knows what Shiro of the Month means, right? Maybe I should have some sort of description there. Teaching, so I also teach as well. So I keep track of my title, the semester that I taught, the course number, the course name, and also how many students I haven't had in the class that semester. So I can say I have taught X number of students over 3 years. Invited talks, those are a little bit different than conference presentations. I didn't have to apply to talk. Somebody reached out to me and said, hey, Jessica, will you come talk to us about this? Cool, yeah, I'm gonna keep track of that. And I'll also do the same thing where I'll throw a link in there if somebody happened to record it, so that I can have evidence of it. So you kind of get the gist of this. I won't go through it. But what's really nice is that once you get, I mean, it's a lot of effort on the upfront to create this. It really is. However, once it is done, now it's super easy to put together a resume or a cover letter, because all I got to do is come here and copy and paste the things that I think are the most valuable for the job that I'm interested in. I even have this one called media coverage, and you can see I stopped doing it in 2018 because I was like, oh my God, there's just too much. And that's not like being braggy. I was just like, oh, this is a pain to track. But if somebody said, Jessica, how are you at showing up? Like, what if the news comes and talks to you? Are you gonna like get really flustered, or are you gonna be okay with that? I'm gonna be okay, and here's evidence of it, right? So I can point them to these sorts of things. And I even had like links here and like the focus of the story. So if somebody wanted an example of writing about recycling, I could go find specifically something about that. Also, another one I have are references, and this is an evolving tab for me. So folks, their name, their phone, their email, actually, if this is going to be recorded, I won't put their email address on there. We can edit this part out later. But I keep that up to date, so that's like, you know, if this person's going to give me a reference for higher ed, I'm going to pull my higher ed people, versus if it's nonprofit, I'm going to pull my nonprofit people. So I'm already thinking about who my references could be for specific fields. So again, a lot of time to do this, a lot of time on the upfront, but it's completely worth it because it will set you up long-term to be able to write strong resumes and cover letters, but also just know more about yourself and what you're good at, and celebrate that over time. Okay. So just real briefly, tracking versus LinkedIn. This will only be a minute or two. Sometimes we get questions about LinkedIn and like, what's the difference? And especially now we talked about tracking. So for me, the difference between them is that tracking is a personal database, right? That's really for my eyes only. Well, now your eyes too. But it's my way of keeping track of myself and things that the office does collectively. LinkedIn is more about your public facing version of yourself. It's public facing accomplishments and experiences. So tracking can actually help you build a strong LinkedIn profile, but a LinkedIn profile may not be useful or even appropriate for tracking everything. So that's where I think kind of having your own personal database is really helpful, because there may be things that you did that maybe you don't feel like it's important enough to show up on your LinkedIn, but you still want to make sure you remember it. So think of your LinkedIn as just another version of a polished virtual resume, right? Usually my LinkedIn is pretty generic. I don't have much specific stuff on there because usually a resume cover letter is specific. Mine's just kind of general sustainability. So I don't get into the nitty gritty there. And if you want to, you can check out my LinkedIn profile. I put my handle there. So you can go look at it and see what kind of a fully fleshed out one is, because I do link to news articles and blogs and stuff there as well. So with that, Christina, do you have anything you wanted to add to that particular slide? No, you good?
That was great.
Awesome. So with that, we'll kind of open it up for questions, conversation. If you guys have any. You can unmute yourself or you can drop it in the chat box.
Yeah, let us know, when was the last time that you updated your resume? Are you currently doing that? Or was there anything here that you learned that you're like, whoa, I want to try that? Everything's on the table. Jessica, that was like the most like modest flex I've ever seen too, going through your tracking document.
I didn't show you all the tabs.
That's right.
Hi, this is Kelly Geckler. That was really great information, and I really like the tracking spreadsheet. I'm like a non-traditional person, and am getting my certificate in sustainable technologies right now. Mm-hmm. And I So I'm trying to pull together all the different things I've done related to sustainability, but my degree, bachelor's and master's, are not in the field. And a lot of my experiences are not necessarily in the field. So you mentioned that you'd be willing to like look at a resume and kind of give some feedback. How would we do that?
Sure, you can just email it to us. So I'll actually just drop our office account in the chat and we'll take a peek at it.
Sure.
Yeah, so I would send it there. And also, so don't necessarily don't be frustrated with like the fact that, oh, my degree or my past experiences weren't aligned with sustainability. Chances are that the great thing about sustainability is that everything is related to sustainability. It may just take a little bit of creative thinking to figure out how it was. So just really spend some time thinking about your past experiences, because I bet there's something in there about sustainability, or there are certainly transferable skills. You know, as sustainability here, we're kind of jacks of all trade. And even though we're sustainability professionals, we also update websites and put together budgets and do hiring paperwork and social media. So there's a lot that we do that wouldn't necessarily neatly fit into the sustainability category, but is really necessary for us to do our job.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. And I kind of feel like I've done a lot of work in like development, resource development, and I would be willing to even, I listened to your other webinar, Zoom meeting a few weeks ago about getting a job in the field. And I thought, you know, that would be a way for me to get in the door someplace if I could work in resource development for a organization or nonprofit that is sustainability focused. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
So would you recommend then including all that then, the more sustainability focused and the resource development kind?
So
I guess it depends on the job, right?
yeah, so I say
Okay.
it depends on the job, but if you think it can play to your sustainability strengths, definitely include it.
Okay.
But yeah, it would always kind of view it through the lens of that particular job.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yep.
So Nick had a question. How would you personally tailor your resume cover letter to fit the work culture of the company you're applying to? I love the idea of crafting a cover letter the way that you did, Jessica, but I'm not sure how well a given company would appreciate deviation from the traditional cover letter format.
So here's what I'll say. Every time I have used that format, I have gotten nothing but compliments from it. And the reason why I have been told is because it looks so different. And remember, that first hurdle is, how do I make myself stand out? So the fact that it looks different was actually something in the positive column for me. I mean, it's a risk, right? It's a risk to do something that's against the norm, but I don't know, I'm pretty confident in it now, and I think that it works. And also, having been on the hiring side and having seen a lot of cover letters, I hate reading cover letters. Like they're the worst part of reading people's job applications, because people don't know how to effectively use them. So I would welcome somebody doing anything that's different than what I normally see. So it's a risk, but I think it's a risk that might be worth it.
Yeah, and I'd say especially in sustainability, that type of deviation from the norm is probably welcome more than not, because it's innovative, it's different, it's outside of the box thinking. And I think that says a lot more about the way that a candidate approaches maybe a traditional problem beyond just this one task.
And you know, if you're comfortable with that particular format, like the literal table, you could do something very similar to that, but in paragraph form. Right? You could say the qualification of or requirement of this job is X, and I fulfill this requirement by doing Y, right? You could write it as a paragraph if that format scares you, but still be very explicit about, I can do this.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's really good advice. I know I'll be my resume and cover letter will be reviewed by some engineers for this job I'm interested in, so that format, I think they might even appreciate it because it's very succinct.
Yeah, I think that format would definitely play to the engineers in the room.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
And the data too.
If you were applying for a journalism job, I may not recommend it, but but you know, where they want to see your writing, but usually people want information succinctly.
So Valerie said, thank you. Thank you for attending, Valerie.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. It's good to see you. Your little avatar there.
This is Kelly again. Is it pretty typical to have a 2-page resume then? I guess in all my former positions I've had, I've always just done a 1-page, but if that's, pretty much accepted, then I may move to that, but.
Yeah, so the answer is of course it depends, right? So it'd be based on the job. If you are using a second page, I would say be very certain that the information that you are providing them, is going to be valuable.
Okay.
So the reason I went to a second page is because there may have been a job where grant writing was explicitly listed as something as a skill that they wanted, and I wanted to provide them evidence that I can do that. And that was my clearest way to do that. But don't just fill space because you feel like you need to fill space. Everything you do, everything you write in your resume and your cover letter should have intention behind it.
Okay. And then recently I found some really cool resumes that are kind of artistic and have a place for your picture, and it's really cool looking, but I'm not sure if maybe it's appropriate for sustainability. You mentioned earlier it's more of a traditional look.
Yeah, so we were actually just talking about this before the webinar. I'm a no photo person. I have a hard line on that. And mainly the reason for that is because having been on hiring committees, there's always going to be unconscious bias. And I think that the less you can open up people to that, the safer you are as a candidate. So people are already going to be making assumptions based on your name. About, what your gender might be or what cultural background you might have. So don't also go out there and put your photo there. And also when we think about Cristina had mentioned, how often do we see folks from minority populations putting their photo on a resume? I've never seen that. And I think that speaks to perhaps the fear that folks have around being perceived differently for how they look. So I'm kind of a hard-lined no photo person.
Okay.
I've been on hiring committees where names have been taken off of resumes to combat anything around just trying to figure out who somebody is based on their name.
Right.
And they're just assigned a number or a letter. So that's kind of where my position, and I think that works actually, is just kind of washing it of who somebody we may assume somebody is.
Okay. So those artistic ones, even that have 2 columns or whatever, aren't necessarily preferred.
So I think those are fine, but I would definitely steer away from personal photos.
Okay.
Sometimes I think I actually pulled one up here real quick. There is a new format that I think I might try out for myself on how you can share skills visually. This sort of.
Yeah, I've seen that.
What's your proficiency with a certain skill? And maybe that helps us address our own comfort with our own ability, right? So I don't feel like I'm overstating something. For example, I might put, WCMS. Now I feel like I'm pretty much an expert in that, right? So I might have a really high bar there, but other things maybe not, right? So it tells the person, hey, I know this, but also I'm not telling you I'm an expert. I know it well enough to be versed in it. So this I think is an interesting way to list skills, and I've been thinking about doing this myself. Or how proficient you are in something, how good you are at something. It gives them more of an indicator, and so we can feel comfortable not saying that maybe we think we're better at something than we are.
Okay.
So I think that's
Jessica,
creative. Yeah.
what would you say is maybe the maximum length a resume should be, or what is the criteria to know when you're maybe going too far?
So for me, I would say a resume should never be more than 2 pages, a front, back. If I were to print it, I want it on one piece of paper. CV, curriculum vitae, which is mainly only for the academic world, and maybe high level CEOs or like corporate level positions where they really want to know everything about you. Those can get really, really lengthy, double-digit pages. But that's really the only markets where those are useful. And even then, there's intentionality behind the length of those and what's included in that. It's not like they made it 20 pages because they put their high school job in there. They're still only being intentional about the experiences they're highlighting, but they're providing more detail about it. So I would say hard stop at 2 pages for a resume, because I want to be able to print it and have it live on one piece of paper.
All right. Any final thoughts, questions? We are a little over time. I appreciate everybody sticking around as long as you have. Remember too that we're going to send you a follow-up email with some of the resources that we mentioned. We can share a template of the tracking document that Jessica shared, you know, of course, without her information, so that you can fill it out and start your own tracking document. You don't have to start from scratch. And we will also send you the slides that you saw here, as well as the recording of this webinar, if ever you want to reflect back. So unless anyone has any final questions or thoughts, we're probably going to wrap this up. Thank you all so much for being here. We hope you have a good rest of your day, and reach out if you have any questions later on.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.